Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched. I'm your host, the Social Solipsist, and this week I watched From Beijing with Love from 1994. Now, my main reason for watching this is sort of twofold. One is that I've seen a couple of clips of it before that looked pretty funny, and I figured it's a short film. I should see it and see what it's about and see what else it has in it. The other is that it is written and directed and starring Stephen Chow, who is a bit of a figure in more modern Hong Kong cinema, especially in the comedic and semi-comedic areas. I think his most notable work, a film that I really love, is Kung Fu Hustle. But the first movie I ever saw of his was Shaolin Soccer, which was like 3 years before that. And I remember seeing that one in theaters when it came out, which on its own, I haven't rewatched Shaolin Soccer in a while. I remember it being quite strong on its own. But Kung Fu Hustle, I rewatch every couple of years, and it still stands up. It's really quite excellent. I love Kung Fu Hustle mostly because it's such a nice mix of sort of traditional Hong Kong action movies and theater with a lot of more comedic aspects and plus some inspiration from Hollywood production and stuff that makes it a little bit. I like to show it as an introduction for people who don't have any familiarity with Hong Kong action cinema, because I think it's a way to ease people in, because it's a little bit more palatable for people who just have a like purely American action viewing history. But it is totally solid on its own. That sort of merging of different cinematic backgrounds does not detract from it at all. In fact, I think it's a really, really solid synthesis. So I haven't really watched he did come up. I didn't even realize until I was looking it up later. He directed another film a couple of years back called The Mermaid, which was really, really well received, and both in China and abroad. And I still haven't watched it. I might soon, but I didn't realize that was one of his. So now it makes me all the more curious. He wouldn't be the person I would expect to have directed that, but I guess I don't know enough about the film. Anyway, I digress. From Beijing with Love is his first film. It's co-directed with one of his frequent collaborators, Li Lik Chi. I believe I'm pronouncing that vaguely right. And it's rough. It's short. Thankfully, it is 83 minutes long. But it was made in 94, 10 years before Kung Fu Hustle. It clearly does not have much of a budget. I don't know much about the production, and it's very hard to find any information. Even the Wikipedia article on this film is extremely sparse and appears to, in part, have been roughly translated from probably the Chinese version of the Wikipedia article. It has very little content in it. It's hard to even get a hold of this film. A couple of streaming services have it. I have a rip from a friend's copy that they gave me a while back. And I'm just going to jump into the technical problems with it, not the least of which is the native, like the original subtitle ripped off the DVD is really bad. Like, I don't speak Mandarin or Cantonese, obviously, but it's very apparent just from the quality of the text and the like English syntax that this was not translated by somebody who was particularly fluent in English. It might be a I initially speculated that it was partially a transliteration issue where they were trying to do a more literal translation, but so many lines are so truncated and so stilted in their phrasing, and there's just there's run-on sentences and non-sentences that don't have like complete syntax and all these other problems that I am sure that ultimately I got a very bad experience with the film due to some pretty poor subtitles. I went around hunting for other subtitles to try and sub them in, no pun intended. And I found some better ones, but they're only kind of cleaned up. I compared them side by side, and there's some slight differences in phrasing, but they're still pretty stilted, and there's only a few errors fixed, and I've managed to find one that actually has the like signage and stuff also subtitled, which seems like a absolutely necessary thing. But my point here is not only that accurate subtitles are super important. Wow, my brain just stopped there. But that like so much of the quality of the film can be determined by the quality of the subtitle and the accuracy of the subtitle, and especially for something that's comedic, especially translating from Chinese or any language that is dramatically different structurally than the language you're translating into. Dubbing is always going to be a problem. Bad subtitling that doesn't accurately portray the tone or pacing or rhythm of the comedy is always going to be a real, it's going to detract severely. And I have to imagine why this has probably never been fixed, is even in the Netflix version, the subtitle I ended up getting was a rip of the Netflix version that you can only get on Netflix Hong Kong. And that's the quote unquote good one, and it's still pretty bad. And I have to imagine that's because this movie is low budget, it's not that popular, it's a little hard to find, and nobody's gone back to redo the subtitles by hand. Or if anyone has, in an unofficial sense, it hasn't been disseminated around. Additionally, apparently this movie has been banned in mainland China because it has part of its plot line is about government corruption. And so the mere mention of that, even in extremely silly terms, an extremely silly presentation, is enough to get it banned because it's China and they don't deal with that shit. That said, I'm glad it's survived nonetheless, even if it's rough around the edges. One day I'd like to rewatch it with a full set of subtitles. Not that I think it would completely overhaul my opinion of the movie, but that it would dramatically improve my experience. As for the actual content of the film, it's a spoof on the spy genre, and in particular, James Bond. There's substantial references to The Man with the Golden Gun. The name itself, the title of the movie in English being From Beijing with Love is obviously a reference to From Russia with Love. But apparently the name of the transliterated name from Chinese is domestically produced 007. Like, that's the title. So they're not pulling any punches with their references on that. So it's interesting. It's always interesting to me how titles get either partially or completely changed when they make translations. But that's interesting on its own. Obviously, one of the major comparisons that could easily be made is something like Austin Powers. Is probably the most substantial and long-running series of James Bond spoofs. Comparatively speaking, they're pretty different from each other. I don't think they actually bear a lot of direct comparison in any particular aspect. As a whole, they've both got their ups and downs. Stylistically, this one definitely leans more into... You can see the threads of Chow's later writing and later capabilities as a writer and director and actor. But it's closer to something like Airplane, or even what's the name of that film? I hate this film. I actually hate this film. Kung Pao, Enter the Fist. I know lots of people really like that film. I can't stand it. I've never made it to the end. It's just kind of awful. But stylistically, it's closer to one of those two in the structure of a lot of it is very short setup and delivery. There are more things that I think are improvements on maybe at least Kung Pao, but probably not Airplane as far as the overarching structure. So this is not while a lot of the beat to beat stuff is where the comedy lies, there are setup and payoff elements scattered throughout the film that work pretty well. Does it redeem it structurally? No, not really. For the most part, the comedic appeal is in the sort of skits or vignettes. And they run the gamut in terms of their quality. It's very slapsticky in a lot of ways. A lot of sight gags and physical comedy. But not totally... It's not it doesn't rely on total absurdity or total gross out or sexual humor or anything like that too much. But there's more than a few things that I think don't work. Again, some of that is probably just an issue of understanding due to subpar subtitling. And also some very specific Chinese references, cultural references, and social references I just don't understand. Some articles in the Wikipedia as well have mentioned references that I have no reference point for as an American, but are interesting from a cinematic standpoint, and also for where Hong Kong cinema stood in terms of its relationship to mainland China and the politics of the time. So while I think it's definitely poking fun at elements of the China culturally and politically, I don't think any of it strikes me as the kind of thing that is supposed to be subversive, overtly subversive, or critical, I guess, of the regime in China. And given that, Stephen Chow was not subsequently, blacklisted or anything, I think clearly it wasn't totally horrible. It's just that, well, in continuing last week's theme, totalitarian regimes are very sensitive to their public perception, both internally and externally. And yeah. Anyway, there's still some interesting things in here. Overall, whether or not it's valuable to as a watch, I think if you were in the same place as me and you're interested in the cinematic history from Stephen Chow, and some of the sort of these intermediate films between sort of the heyday of Hong Kong imports in the 80s to the like very clear cross-cultural influences that came in the late 90s and 2000s. I think it's interesting in that sense. Whether or not it's an actually like good film and very funny, I would say probably not on either of those fronts. That said, it's not without its merits as well. Stephen Chow himself is always an excellent physical comedian and very expressive in a whole lot of ways. He's a smart writer, has some great ideas for comedy in general, just innovative thoughts and ways of doing comedy and ways of doing certain gags or twists on old gags that work pretty solidly. A number of most of the other characters don't particularly stand out. His sort of female foil character is interesting and competent in her own right, but not particularly standout. She puts on a fair performance, but nothing like really extraordinary. And I think that's difficult, being aside next to, I think anybody in Hong Kong style action cinema in particular, is just the physicality of it, and the somewhat inherently over the top, and in this case, deliberately cheesy expression of certain actions that, side by side, the more straight character is always going to pale in comparison. So it's hard to have too much of a critique. At the same time, it's also, I have to take with a grain of salt that my my enjoyment or criticism of a performance is always going to be in no small part affected by my lack of direct reading of their performance. If they're speaking Chinese, then I have to go based on the delivery I hear, how I interpret the tone, and then what I'm reading on the screen, and piecing that together myself. And whether or not it flows correctly is in part up to my brain and my interpretation. It's also worth noting that this has some substantial... The audio is kind of all over the place. Musically, there's some music that is borderline ripping off, the Bond films, and some other tracks from some other films. The audio mixing is rough for sure, and there's always almost universally audio problems in Chinese films when they come over. at least to my ear. And that's even for much higher budget, much bigger productions. I remember, I think it's Hero has some real bad audio. And this is a mix of different things. One is just, I think the technical expectations put on the Chinese and Hong Kong cinemas are like there's less of a focus on certain audio elements. Hollywood has its own audio problems, especially in the leveling, especially in action films, tend to be just fucking awful in terms of like being deafened, followed by like straining to hear dialogue. But one of the things that I think compounds, or two of the things that I think compound Chinese cinema quite often, a little bit less so in more recent years, but for a long time. And I think I may have talked about this before with, what was the name of that film? I don't remember. The one I did before, the other Hong Kong action film I did before. Anyway, is that they are recorded twice, and they are recorded often with substantial amounts of ADR in both versions. They're recorded twice because more often than not, they're done once native in the native language, which is usually Cantonese, I believe, because if I'm remembering right, that is the native Chinese language of Hong Kong, and that is where a lot of China's films are made. And then they are redubbed in Mandarin. I apologize if I have that backwards. But in both cases, they tend to have substantial amounts of ADR. And again, there's less of a technical focus on getting that ADR to match perfectly. My suspicion, I'm going off this with no real background, is that so much of both mainland China and Hong Kong and other outlying Chinese-speaking areas are so used to watching dubbed content that worrying about perfect audio mixing is probably not something they're super concerned about, because often the audio won't even match what's on screen in the first place. So bothering to mix it extremely carefully is probably not the number one priority, and I think that makes perfect sense. That said, I always try and watch these films in the original language they were recorded in, just because I would rather watch the original performance, I guess. Even when I think this film's probably most of the ADR is front loaded or in a few scenes, but yeah, it's always a bit of a struggle trying to figure out which audio track I'm supposed to be listening to make sure I'm watching the original performance. Anyway, I digress. So definitely some technical issues, some of it budgetary, some of it regional, some of it cultural, and some of it historical in terms of not being continued to be distributed after release for censorship reasons. Beyond all that, like stylistically, it's amusing, but it's a very loose, very low budget. Like when they try and reproduce elements from references to other films and things like that, like it's very it's deliberate and or without alternative, but the things are cheap and kind of goofy, but I think it works out just fine. And cinematically, while this is definitely not a particularly pretty film to watch, some of Chow's directorship and editing is clearly still here. Years before his sort of breakouts. The style is there, and some of it is down to both stylistically seems to be both from Hong Kong action cinema as well as a number of foreign cinematic influences. Obviously, if you're aping British and American productions from 20, 30, 40 years before, some of those cinematic influences are going to come through in your own directorship as well. I actually don't know if he made other films before this. This is allegedly his first wide release film, but I would be curious to know what his full history is. But even for his rather long career, he's kind of poorly documented for English-speaking audiences, that is. Anyway, this one was interesting. Again, it's kind of sloppy. It's not the funniest thing. It's got a lot of technical problems, but I still didn't regret the time I spent going over it and sort of experiencing what it had to tell me about a whole lot of things. Anyway, I actually talked about this one way more than I expected to, but anyway, I'm going to stop my rambling. Thank you guys for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched. I've been the Social Solipsist, and I'll see you guys next time.